Right.
Okay. All right, so welcome back. And so we will now move ahead to the second session for the afternoon today. For shred number 3, discussing the current rate making mechanisms. The first rate making mechanism that we'll discuss is just the general rate case and the general rate making process. For the general rate case design, stakeholders were mainly split on 2 key issues, one being the general rate making process itself, and 2 being the inclusion of the future test year approach in general rate making. Mid-American and IAWC maintain that the general rate case design works as intended, while SETI and Mr. Wright contended is ineffective at reviewing assets and investments. They propose an IRP to oversee this review to better incorporate into the general rate case design. As far as the future test year approach, IAWC also notes that the approach has been helpful in maintaining a dynamic rate making in Iowa, with other stakeholders arguing the opposite, proposing to either repeal it, adjust it to include the provision of evidence when applying for it, or introducing a multi-year rate plan approach to address it, which we have discussed previously. Clean Energy Districts of Iowa also proposes introducing an integrated docket cycle for the opportunity to plan for general rate cases and other planned proceedings on a scheduled cycle for the docket itself. And so moving to the discussion questions that we have for this section. How would the proposed issues with the general rate case be addressed if an IRP was not introduced? Some stakeholders have suggested that the future test year approach should not be applied in the general rate case process, when hiring an independent third-party consultant to review the reasonableness of future test year applications, address some of stakeholders' concerns, and lastly, what changes, if any, are needed to be able to create an integrated cycle schedule for all related dockets. So with that, I'll open the floor for questions and give any stakeholders mentioned opportunity to address any of these questions or comments.
Sorry, would you just explain the first question a little bit more?
Yeah, so the one of the proposals, or what some of the written comments stated that the general rate case process is currently ineffective at providing the venue to review the merits of assets and investments, with the suggested change being to establish an IRP process. So we are asking the question, if an IRP process was not introduced, how could these issues be addressed under other circumstances?
I'm sorry, say that again?
So there was a comment in the written comments that currently the general rate case process is ineffective at providing a venue to review or deliberate over the merits of assets and investments when they are proposed. And then with a suggested change to address that issue to be to establish an integrated resource planning process that would review the merits of each generation asset and the generation investments to when included in the general rate case process or rate case proceeding. And so we, just as a question, we are considering whether there are additional ways that the issues of not being able to review the merits of these assets and investments can be achieved outside of an IRP process.
Okay, this is Dave Charloon for IBEC. I don't think there is. I'm not really, I'm still having difficulty catching up to that question. But even the advanced rate making principles proceedings, I mean, if that's the first time you hear about a project being dropped, that's not really a meaningful review. It's particularly not meaningful in terms of producers making plans for their asset decisions. So if you're not going to have an IRP, I don't understand how you fixed it anywhere in the rate making process.
Jennifer Easler, I agree. One reason is because most of the generation assets that are reviewed in an IRP would be considered in an advanced rate making case, and unless there's some question about the prudence of the spending, the asset comes into rate base in the general rate case. And there isn't further review of whether it's an appropriate asset.
Matt?
So both OCA and IBEC just said that it's not a meaningful, the advanced rate making process isn't a meaningful review, but it's a review prior to making the spend or building the asset. So at what point is a meaningful review? You want us to come in for historic test year where we've already spent the money. You don't want us to come in for future test years where we ask permission to spend the money, or advanced rate making where we ask to spend the money. So when I would just like more clarity on what is the meaningful review that everyone's looking for. At what point in time of the process should that happen? I mean, and
I'll answer that. I'll go with the IRP.
we just saw with
when you had the advanced rate making principles, I haven't seen one yet that wasn't filed under an emergency. Oh my God, we got to do this right away kind of basis. And boom, there's okay. So that's the asset, up or down on the asset.
So we performed a resource plan in 2020, a year-long process. We then tried to find assets to fill the resources that were planned for in the IRP. Took another year to identify some, but not all of those. So there was a year gone. So now we're in 2021. We filed for advanced rate making. It then takes 2 years to get through that process. We're now, when did we start the IRP process? 19. We're 4 years
You
later.
engage stakeholders in that process in 2020?
Yeah. Absolutely. IBEC participated, OCA participated, the board participated, LEG participated. The board did participate. Everyone was involved in that process. That's what I don't understand, is when is it that everyone wants to participate? The more transparency we offer, the more you complain about the transparency that we offer.
Jennifer Easler. So I think this harkens back to the IRP discussion, as Dave mentioned, and it's the need to have an ongoing review when circumstances change, when prices change, when plans change. We need to have a regular process for reviewing the resource plan. It's not practical to conduct an IRP in the middle of a rate case. And for all practical purposes, we think the IRP should happen, in advance of heading into the advanced rate making principal case.
Did we do that?
I tried to explain, I think it needed some updating.
So when is it stale? I mean, we were less than a year from finishing when we filed for advanced rate making.
I don't know if this is the time or place for that, but I think the timely updates are what have been suggested in the earlier conversation, and I think would be helpful when you're heading into the advanced rate making and then asking for recovery in the rate case.
But again, everybody just wants more bites at the same apple.
Dave on Zoom.
Yeah, to kind of address, Matt's concerns. I think, it's the ongoing process of updating the IRP, like Jennifer mentions, as things change, to make sure, you're still following the best course of action for customers, because at the end of the day, it's going to be customers paying for that asset, and they're going to be paying for it for the next 20 to 30 years. So I think, I don't think there should be any rush, to hurry up and get this into rates. I mean, let's do it, in a reasonable fashion to make sure it still makes sense as you see, different things change throughout the course from the time, you have a integrated resource plan come out. You'll see other things that can impact that, changes in the capacity market, changes in the cost of the resource, tax changes. I mean, you still need to keep account of all these ongoing changes to make sure you're still following the best course of action.
Lori Williams, I'm attorney with Sierra Club. I wasn't in IPL's latest advanced rate making, so I don't know the details of what happened there, but I can understand the frustration with, there was a pandemic, there were major shifts in the market, including in load and kind of load shapes and, huge shortages around certain technologies. And there were some pretty significant market disruptions in the last few years. So I think when there's a major change circumstance, like the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, there might be such a big shift that you do need to update that analysis, but hopefully it would generally be required. To get to the question of how can you address it in a rate case, Sierra Club actually participated in IPL's 2018 rate case. It was a while ago. And their IRP process came out of a settlement where we had raised the question of the prudency of some continued investments in their existing fleet, which we saw the rate case as a reasonable venue for going after that. But I think there's some core challenges with trying to address those issues in a rate case. There are so many issues in a rate case that folks are trying to work through that it really doesn't give resource planning the kind of attention from all parties that it deserves. Rate cases are incredibly resource intensive, and it asks a lot of participants to intervene in a rate case. And then of course, not every utility comes in for a rate case every couple of years. So if you have a utility that's going 10 or 15 years without a rate case, there might be tremendous investments made during that time into the existing rate base that haven't been reviewed, and that you're going to have to put the board in an uncomfortable position of potentially retroactively reviewing the prudence of those investments and potentially disallowing them, which of course the utility will say will impact that credit rating. So it's really not a good way to do planning. You really would prefer, I think it gives the utility more certainty to be doing it on a forward-looking basis rather than a backward-looking basis.
Are there any comments from stakeholders as far as the inclusion of the future test year in the general rate case and the proposed revisions surrounding that legislation?
I'm sorry, are you on question 2?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So we suggested some adjustments that we think would help address future test year rate cases. And I don't think an independent third-party consultant would solve the items that we talked about. I mean, a lot of the role we play is to investigate the filing, and our recommendations on the future test year is to recognize that one of the policy challenges that we're trying to address in this inquiry is how to deal with utility rate affordability. And it's our feeling that future test year rate making is contributing to higher rates, and they're reaching a problematic level for some Iowans. And we've suggested that, you know, if utilities rates are in the very low quartile, meaning that you have the highest rates in the region, that you should not use a future test year for your rate making. Additionally, when you do use the future test year for setting rates, it would be useful to file thereafter the financial information about your costs and revenues, so that we can have confidence that the future test year rates are just and reasonable going forward. The first of those would require a legislative change, the second would not.
What was Cecil?
Well, just a short answer. I mean, I think that would hiring an independent third-party consultant to review the reasonableness of future test year applications address some of stakeholders' concerns. They might, but ratepayers going to pay for it. I don't know that it provides enough benefit that it's worth charging the ratepayers for a third party. And no matter what that third party does, the board still has to go through it and evaluate the entire case and make the decision. So I don't know that you've accomplished anything except you have another piece of evidence that the board can consider. So I'd say no.
Iowa American believes that the future test year approach is a valuable asset to Iowa regulatory rate making and would encourage to maintain that. And within a future test year, the board still looks at the reasonableness of rates so the affordability can be considered within the context of that. We haven't really analyzed whether a third party consultant is necessary. My gut feeling is it's probably not. I think it's probably we have enough information from these charrettes that the board can make an informed decision, or the legislature could also make an informed decision on that. But it is a costly undertaking, and who would pay for that is a real consideration.
Jeff.
Jeff from Alliant. Yeah, I agree with Rachel. I mean, the future test year is just one approach. Our interveners do have the ability to hire independent third parties, and so you get lots of independent third parties, or maybe not independent from their interest, but independent from the utility or the board's interest. That does provide that level of scrutiny into a rate application. So there are expert witnesses, they do come in the case. OCA has its own experts that can handle some of these issues. So I don't think we need that independent third party as a mandatory component of either a future or a historic test year. You know, we're not talking about formula rates here, which is a very different sort of approach. I understand Jennifer and OCA, you know, they're concerned about the accuracy and the just and reasonable rates that come out of a future test year. But the same can be said for a historic test year, because a historic test year could be set on a historic year that has an unusual expense as well. So I just would caution the board towards approaching the future test year differently than a historic test year. All of these are a means of a forecast rates that will be charged to customers for some period of time. That's based on some number, whether it's historic, future, multiple years. All forecasts are wrong inherently. Sales will change, costs will change. The process that we have today does not provide a utility the opportunity to earn a reasonable return. And that's a big piece of this, in addition to the affordability. We care about affordability too. So I think that's the balance that the board has to strike is, are we setting just and reasonable rates, with affordability, and an opportunity for the utility to earn a return? I think that's ultimately what we're trying to accomplish. There's lots of ways to do
that. Dave on Zoom.
Yeah, and this is Dave Ogenson with the Large Energy Group. Yeah, and specifically to hiring an independent third consultant, I really don't see that kind of providing any kind of value. For example, the OCA, other intervener groups, are going to have their own interests, and they're going to be advocating, on behalf of their customers, in that proceeding, and again, customer affordability is one of the biggest issues that we look at. So again, I really don't see very much value in bringing in a third party to kind of look at the reasonableness of the proceeding, because, you know, to a certain extent, you would already have that going on, you know, within a rate case proceeding, whether it's a historic test year or a future test year.
Thank you. Samantha?
Yeah, I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding what just and reasonable rates means. It doesn't mean that you are the lowest, or then it correspondingly, if you are the highest, it doesn't mean they're not just and reasonable. I mean, you set those rates based on the cost of service and the utility's unique situation. So I also would hesitate to support any sort of legislation they would saying, well, is one utility gets something if they fall within a certain ranking, or another utility gets something else if they fall within a certain ranking, but then you're precluded, because that could change. It could really cause a lot of confusion. It's going to hurt planning for both customers and utilities. And I think that's a risky path to go down, although absolutely IEA is concerned about affordability, transparency, just and reasonable rates, all of that. But this discussion, I think we're conflating a few things, confusing a few things that I think is a dangerous path to go down.
If there are no other comments on the future test year approach, I just wanted to give Clean Energy Districts of Iowa the opportunity to address their proposal in their written comments for the creating an integrated cycle schedule for general rate case filings and any other planned proceedings. If there is someone from SETI who would like to speak to this effect.
Yeah, thank you. This is Jim Martin Schramm. Andy Johnson submitted our comments prior to the Charrette, and I think all I can do is refer you to those. Having some sort of regular schedule, I think would be in the best interests of all parties, but especially small entities, nonprofits like SETI, which doesn't have unlimited dollars, and participation in these dockets is not a minor affair. So having some sense of when an IRP is going to be reviewed, some sense of when the next rate case is going to come, that helps our organization, and I would assume others as well, to plan their budgets accordingly.
Great, thank you, Jim. All right, if there are no additional comments on the general rate case topic, we will move ahead to advanced rate making. So among the existing rate making components, advanced rate making garnered the most comments, with a majority of stakeholders expressing a strong desire for substantial revisions. The range of proposals concerning the advanced rate making process extends from repealing the principles altogether to expanding them to include additional generation sources. Some stakeholders mentioned in the written comments that the fixed ROE is no longer justified for inclusion in advanced rate making principles, with proposals to disallow fixed ROEs in advanced rate making proceedings, or having the same ROE as the previously contested rate case. Most stakeholders comment that the advanced rate making principles should continue, but under the prior approval of an IRP. And then just for the questions for discussion on this topic, how would advanced rate making work if an IRP process were to be introduced in Iowa? SETI, IABCE, and IBEC have suggested that a premium ROE should not be authorized for resources applying for advanced rate making. Should the applicable ROE be the same ROE that was authorized in the general rate case? If so, and why? And then how do you anticipate advanced rate making working with federal programs supporting generation and transmission build out? Does Iowa need both advanced rate making and federal incentives? So I'd like to open the floor up if there are any comments from the proposals and written comments or addressing these questions for discussion? Cecil.
Well, I'll start. I mean, I wrote my comments and I pretty much said what I had to say. I think the IRP process should be implemented and that advanced rate making, if it is requested by the utility, should be consistent with that IRP analysis. And I think IRP should be a part of the support for whatever generation facilities are proposed in the advanced rate making. I made some other suggestions with regard to advanced rate making, but you can read those in my comments.
Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. As saying, we had a lot of comments on this as well. I don't need to repeat them. One question that I see lacking though is the suggestion to expand advanced rate making to include other technologies that are currently not captured, recognizing changing sort of reliability needs on the system, whether that's storage or other types of resources to balance, dispatchable resources to balance inputs. Is that intentionally left off?
No, not intentionally left off. Sorry, I have it here in my notes as a follow-up question as well. With that being said, are there any comments from stakeholders in response to IPL's question from their proposal of expanding that advanced rate making principle should be expanded to include additional resources or other technologies?
Jennifer Easler, we expressed comments opposing an expansion of advanced rate making principles for other resources. I think that it's important to try to stay focused on what issues are presented in this proceeding, why we're here. There are stakeholders who are unhappy with Iowa rates. And to me, expanding advanced rate making will only exacerbate that. And I hope that we can ask and answer more questions about how are we going to do better to make rates more affordable for customers. An IRP process, I think, will be helpful in looking at whether other resource options are appropriate. And I think we get to, the outcome that Jeff is suggesting, you know, wanting to invest in other types of resources. And then you'd have stakeholders engaged and you'd have a plan and you know, it wouldn't give you all that certainty that you might want with a large generation investment, but I don't think you need the same type of policy for those smaller applications.
Jim on Zoom.
Yeah, thank you. Jim Martin Schramm's Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. You know, this is where the policy context and the recent changes brought about by the infrastructure bill and the IRA have really changed things significantly. The ARP, as I understand it, was adopted to give utilities a greater degree of confidence that what they're proposing is going to be that they'll be able to recover their costs, and the state wanted to see some of these projects built because they thought they would bring benefits to the state of Iowa in terms of accomplishing our carbon reduction goals, or you know, whatever. And so, I mean, the reality is you don't really need premium ROEs to accomplish significant investments in wind and solar and even battery storage or energy storage, because the infrastructure bill and the IRA provide really significant resources to the utility industry for those sorts of investments. So I guess maybe I haven't thought about all the possible technologies that could be trotted out, but right now I can't think of one that would justify a premium ROE and would require necessarily an ARP process.
So I appreciate OCA's, the way Jennifer framed this and sort of trying to bring it back to, why are we here? Like, what's the purpose of the charrettes at the beginning? But I thought that one of those two would be to ensure or make sure that we're providing reliable service to our customers. And I think, as we go through the energy transition and looking at different types of technologies that are being developed and demonstrated today, I think that it could be helpful and really important to expand the type of generation technologies available, but also to include storage as a part of that as well, to help ensure that we have the ability to seek rate-making principles on the types of projects that would support reliable service for our customers as well. So I think that could be some really strong benefits in expanding ARP, making it tech neutral, and then also including that storage piece to it as well. So that's something that we would definitely support.
Matt?
So I'm always somewhat frustrated by the focus on ROE specifically and the request to have legislation regarding ROE. The board clearly is a rate-making body and knows how to set an ROE, weighs evidence, and then sets an ROE in all kinds of different proceedings. They've shown that they know how to use those levers to encourage X, Y, or Z based upon the evidence presented before them in a contested case. So continuing to focus on this ROE question, I think that has been litigated on a case-by-case basis, and the board has shown that they know how to use those levers to encourage or discourage certain things. The reference to federal tax credits incentivizing the utility to do certain things, again, at IPL, every tax credit that we get for all of these builds goes straight back to customers through the EAC per board rules. We don't necessarily get an incentive and make money because we are building something that has more tax credits. We make decisions, again, based on a planning process and what's in the best interest of the customers coming out of that planning process. So I just want to make those points. And again, the board has shown the ability to use the ROE to incentivize things. And I think they should be continuing to allow to do that as a rate-making body and legislating. I believe that seeing ROE show up in the Iowa statutes is a bad thing, because the legislature cannot predict the future just like the board can't, and taking away flexibility to incentivize or disincentivize investment in the future is dangerous.
Cecil?
Oh, I just want to kind of segue what Matt has said. I think his point is correct, that the board can set that, but because of the way the statute is currently written, whatever the board does goes for the life of the facility. And I think you're right, Ed. You can't predict the future, so maybe the board should rethink how they do ROEs in advanced rate making documents. But I think what has happened in the history is that they have given higher ROEs because they can't predict the future, so they're trying to anticipate and protect the utilities against risk. And if there's a better way to do that, then I agree it shouldn't be in the statute, even though I'm opposed. So I think my main point is, what is the purpose of advanced rating? It's to ensure that the system is reliable. and for the utilities ratepayers. And that should be the focus. And I think I don't want to comment on. So allowing advanced rate making for facilities that aren't needed or that have not supported by the need for reliability, I don't think is a good policy. And I think that that's the changes that should be made, that advanced rate making should be for those facilities that the utility projects will be needed to provide reliable service to their ratepayers in the future. And that's it. I mean, if they want to do something else, they need to do it in some other form. And then what's happened is ratepayers are then backstopping all of the generation facilities that are being approved in advanced rate making. And I don't think that's correct either. So there need to be some changes made. I made some proposals, and I'm not saying they're correct, but I think it needs to be rethought exactly what is the purpose of advanced rate making. And it really needs to take out question or the statute that says if the utility files it, the board shall grant advanced rate making. I think the board should have the option of saying, no, we don't think you should get in. You should be building this, or you shouldn't get in advanced rate making. I don't know if the current statute allows the board that flexibility. I think on the current statute, if they file, you've got to give them something.
Blake.
Thanks. Blake Rowan, Mid-American Energy. I mean, I think when we look at advanced rate making, it's really about kind of that long-term certainty. I mean, we are entering into essentially a 40-year contract for ROEs, and the concept of a premium ROE now might be a good deal for customers 15, 20 years from now with with what's going on. But it's that long-term certainty over that whole generation, life that's really important as we make those investment decisions. And it's really also to just, ensure those investments are occurring here in Iowa for Iowa customers.
I think that something Cecil said gets at the first question. And that is that if you're getting should you get advanced rate making principles for something you don't need, right? That isn't going to help with reliability, that isn't going to help with affordability. And an IRP process will help reveal what assets might fit within those parameters and which won't. And I think, it was passed initially to incentivize, right? And one of the incentives was the certainty that utilities want, and understandably so, for an investment of that size. But are other incentives beyond that certainty needed? And I think that is one of the things that also needs to be clarified in the statutes. Are we truly incentivizing? And if so, what is that incentive? Is certainty enough of an incentive? Because certainty may not be here. It may be, yes, you can build it and you can recover for it. That we've kind of gotten ourselves into a process where it's no, we're going to give you a bonus to build this. One, I think a lot of us here is probably not needed at this point, especially for projects that don't contribute to reliability and affordability. So I think that, Cecil was right, and that these processes do need to fit together. And the statute should probably be reevaluated for what are we trying to drive? What behavior are we trying to drive through advanced rate making? So that's.
So again, we just referred to it as a bonus to the utilities. And I know that there have been comments about utilities have made this number of dollars more based on an ROE set in advanced rate making. That is ignoring the other half of the story, that over that time period, ROEs were set in general rate cases, also looking at the blended ROE and understanding what the blended ROE of the utility was. So it's no guarantee that, but for advanced rate making, a different ROE would not have been set in a general rate case. And the all other ROE would have made up for that. So it's disingenuous when one of the requirements that we're required to file in rate cases is the blended ROE, and that number is talked about in rate cases. I mean, that's also used in settlement discussions for rate cases. The board has referenced it in final orders for general rate cases. So again, it's disingenuous to say that that utilities have made this much more money because of this, because it's unclear of what would have happened in those general rate cases had advanced rate making not been there.
Any other comments on advanced rate making at this time? Jim on Zoom.
Yes, Jim Martin Schramm, Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. I guess the comment by the last speaker, in my view, reaffirms my view that we shouldn't have ROEs in ARPs or premium ROEs. If a project makes sense, it should be consistent with the IRP. It should be brought forward in a contested proceeding in a rate case, and the ROE for that project needs to be considered then in conjunction with the ROE for everything else that the utility is asking for. So I think we've gotten to that point. It's just not clear to me that the ARP process has served its purpose, but at this point, it's not clear to me why it needs to be perpetuated.
Any last comment, response? Dave.
Dane Stevens, Mid-America, just with respect to the IRP process and the interplay with advanced rate making. This maybe goes without saying, but people should understand once you start an IRP process, say it's a 2-year cycle or a 3-year cycle, you pretty much lock in your variables, assumptions at the front end. Because if you keep changing them every 15 minutes when something changes, you'll never complete it. So I think generally accepted practice is to sort of lock those in, complete the study, having in mind you're going to do another one. So even in the case of Mid-American's commitment to the resource evaluation study, there will be an update, to that study. And why I'm making the point is it's possible that in the 2 or 3 years, whatever it is, in the general case of an IRP, that conditions change. So for example, MISO's rules around resource adequacy could change. We could have a sudden change in our outlook, in our capacity position. There could be a sudden change in EPA rules. There could be a sudden tax law change. So this maybe even helps my point that IRPs are rigid and flexible, because if the expectation is that an advanced rate making principles filing must line up exactly with the IRP, there's a problem there. Again, that would prevent the utility from doing the right thing to respond to changing circumstances, changing conditions, such as the ones I just laid out. So, I think if anything, there has to be, consideration that an advanced rate making principles filing could be and likely will be different from an IRP process, just because of the passage of time, new information, variables have changed, so on and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, Debbie Buggs, Synapse Energy Economics. I know this is the topic, but I did want to respond to what just the classification of the IRP and the need to set variables from the start. Robust IRP processes involve multiple scenarios and the ability to test different changes. So I've never seen the federal government or MISO move quickly and suddenly on making major changes. There's rules issued, then there's comment periods. There's with MISO, with the capacity structure, there have been many working groups and the process has been extensive. That in an IRP, there's an ability to test multiple scenarios evaluate different potential capacity structures, different potential like regulatory rules. That's the point of an IRP, is we're supposed to test different views of what is likely to happen in the world.
Jennifer?
Thanks. I just wanted to make the point that I think one reason statutory change is not needed is I think the board has the tools it needs to make the right decisions on advanced rate making projects. Their authority is broad to consider the need for a resource and the attributes that a resource presents, the risks that it presents, the benefits that it presents. The board's in a good position to look at those features and decide whether it's good and whether ratepayers should be on the hook for that project. They look at various analyses in doing so. And if not advanced rate making, what is our process? I think IRP is a good tool to inform that. And I hope that we can move forward with that tool and to incorporate timely updates as we go along. And I just want, one of the reasons we have low unstable rates in Iowa, and those rates in the market are available not just, in one service territory. Those are broadly available and broadly benefiting customers in Iowa. I think we just need to act cautiously as we're thinking about changes we want, to make sure that we're investing in a future that's good for Iowa. And allow the board to have the tools it needs to make the decisions on whether a facility is eligible and what type of rate making principles should be awarded.
Seth Davison, Mid-American Energy. Appreciate Jennifer's remarks there. And the idea of the board needing to have the tools in its toolkit to have, success there for the next 20 years. I guess I am a little bit, I guess I kind of am identifying a disconnect between that statement and the willingness to kind of broaden the current ARP statute. Because, that was, as we know, promulgated back in 2001, or sorry, passed back in 2001. So I guess if we're going to enable the board to have the tools it needs to continue with this, 20 years from now, is it appropriate to be using a toolkit that was created 40 years ago to accommodate, advancement in technology that has occurred since then? Again, going back to the idea of broadening the technologies contemplated in the statute.
I think I would just go back to my earlier statement that we can look at the resource options in an IRP process. I don't know, it may come to a point where storage is as expensive as 4,000 megawatts of wind. I don't know. But I think, the storage option, I think one thing I learned in the last set of rate making principles cases is that's a developing technology and we have a lot more to learn about it, and not all of it's ready for play and installation here in Iowa. So I don't mean to say it should never be changed, but at this time, I think our focus should be on how do we assure reasonable rates going forward? And I appreciate, the utilities' efforts to do so and to, consider, the tax incentives that are available to support those investments. And, just to be mindful of, you know, the customers who are on the hook for these investments ultimately in the long run.
Carrie.
And I was just gonna say, I mean, if you were able to take a full look at the picture of, you know, including incentives that are, you know, up-to-date incentive information and things like that, where we're looking at the whole system and, you know, at what point in time does a different technology come into competition with existing resources or a current new resource that you could build, versus like battery storage is really expensive compared to what, right? And so that's where the IRP is so important. You know, mentioned earlier, like the Dwayne Arnold situation, and what if we had taken a look at the system as a whole at that point in time? So I think that's where all of this starts to become, just sends us back to the IRP conversation about, you know, compared to what. So we need to know compared to what, and once we have some of that information, then maybe we start to have the advanced rate making conversation.
Dave on Zoom.
Yeah, that's why you have IRPs. I mean, you put a forecast 20 years into the future. You develop different scenarios that says, what about storage? What about small nuclear reactors? That's where you study that stuff.
Any last comments on advanced rate making? All right, thinking we will move to the next topic then on revenue sharing. Several stakeholders see the benefits of Mid-American's current revenue sharing mechanism, while a few suggest some changes. Mid-American, IEA, IAWC, and OCA maintain that the current revenue sharing mechanism is working as intended, so no changes should be included. IEA suggests that the IUB should review the intergenerational inequity and unjust and unreasonable cost allocation that has resulted in an artificially high EAC due to Mid-American's revenue sharing mechanism, suggesting that the mechanism should be reviewed periodically in a contested case proceeding. And then Large Energy Group proposes that if revenue sharing is going to continue in its current form, it needs to reflect the additional cost of transmission to facilitate the sale of excess renewable energy, and those transmission costs should not be shifted onto the customers of other utilities, suggesting to reflect transmission costs to facilitate the sale of excess renewable energy. So with that summary and the discussion questions of should all utilities be provided with the option to adopt revenue sharing, should revenue sharing be legislatively mandated, and is the benefit of the revenue sharing mechanism to ratepayers different when they receive the proceeds of revenue sharing in the form of a credit on their bills versus having those proceeds be used by the utility to lower facility depreciation. And so with that, we'll open it up if there are any comments from stakeholders to discuss these.
Since no one wants to talk, I'm kind of curious about the last question. From the utility standpoint, I assume that the amount of savings would be the same here. It's just a matter of whether the savings are being shown to them or not, right?
Can you rephrase?
So the last question here is asking if the benefit of the revenue sharing mechanism to ratepayers is different when they receive the proceeds of revenue sharing in the form of credits on their bills versus having those proceeds be used to lower facility depreciation. Is the total savings there? I think that the first option is it's clearer to the consumer that they're saving money through the revenue sharing. But I'm curious if there's a difference in a total savings for the consumer, depending on whether it's, lowering depreciation or being shown as a bill credit.
Like growing Mid-American Energy. So I would say it kind of comes to time value of money. However, by having it be low, increasing depreciation, you're lowering the rate base for the company, right? So you're kind of, and then by our revenue sharing mechanisms, we're actually paying off the higher ROE assets first, and then kind of as well as advancing some of our coal reductions and other items like that. So it kind of creates a spiraling effect too, where now all of a sudden the revenue sharing threshold for the next year is lower because we've paid off some of the higher ROE assets. So I would argue probably the lower facility depreciation is actually more beneficial to customers over the life. I know $1 now versus $1 10, 20, however many years from now does impact the way people view it, but that doesn't mean that it's better. It's just kind of probably a feel for the customer. Is that
right? Yeah. So the customer potentially could be gaining more long term with the current method, but might feel better with seeing it as a bill credit.
That's me.
Yeah, I don't want to rehash IEA's comments on this. I think, tried to be pretty clear about some of the concerns. It was interesting to me in hearing the multi-year rate plan with earnings sharing discussion versus performance-based rates versus the discussion we're now going to have. I think that there can be a place for these types of things, but there need to be some confines and there need to be some metrics we're measuring against. I think right now, as we understand, like revenue sharing, like pretty much just everything goes in there. And then if the ROE is hit or not, determines whether, determines the amount of money that is spent, used to spend down rate base versus retained by the company as, a reward, I guess, for prudently managing its business, I think is the concept. But if there are other metrics like we talked about that aren't just ROE, so reliability, complaints, all those other things that measure how a utility is running its business, is it operating efficiently, et cetera, I think that's good. But that doesn't happen with revenue sharing. And I think the other thing that concerns IEA is, and I think we've talked about this in other discussions today, is kind of that indefinite stay out of a rate case. Regular rate cases can be very healthy things. They can help evaluate utility operations. They can evaluate cost of service, cost allocation, rate design. It can evaluate all of these different things, but by virtue of how revenue sharing is currently designed, that opportunity does not present itself for customers, and it won't for several generations of customers, hence the intergenerational equity that we talk about. And I think as you were getting at, $1 today versus $1 tomorrow, there are customers today versus, customers 10, 20 years from now. Is that the right approach? And so those are some of the concerns in addition to those we mentioned in our comments that we have with how revenue sharing is currently structured. I don't know that we have a position necessarily on number one. I think if it's part of we're going to do performance-based rates or we're going to do earnings sharing, then yes, it should be afforded to all, regardless of where they fall on the scale of affordable to unaffordable rates, depending on whose judgment you're using. But should revenue sharing be legislatively mandated? No, I don't think so. It is purely a creation of board order. And I think that it's going to take a whole lot to engage in the process to determine what those metrics are if we're going to put something in legislation to establish a program that would really fit and work well for customers and for the utilities.
Any other comments at this time on revenue sharing or the discussion questions? Cecil?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Sam said. I think for me, the key is revenue sharing needs to be looked at periodically. Because I think the question of intergenerational equity, I mean, should the money be flowed back to the current ratepayers? Or should it be reduced depreciation for future ratepayers to get the benefit of it? I think those questions need to be looked at periodically. I don't think you just lock them in and leave it that way for 10, 15, 20 years. So that's my follow-up. I just think there are parts of the revenue sharing mechanism that it needs to be looked at to make sure that the board considers the way that any sharing is done as one item. Is it the way that the board thinks it should be done?
Any other comments at this time on revenue sharing?
So just to respond to Sam's comment that regular rate cases can be healthy. Typically speaking, not I've litigated across the country, but you don't have a rate case to decrease rates and you don't have a rate case to increase reliability. Usually it's because rates need to go up. So regular rate cases sometimes suggest that rates are going to go up for ordinary ratepayers. Now, can rates go down in a rate case? Certainly they can. But that's pretty uncommon, particularly for your residentials. So while I understand the notion of that, I think if you have regular rate cases in general, rates are probably going up, and that will affect everyday Iowans more. So just on that notion, I don't know that having rate cases all the time will help Iowans for affordability.
I just want to add, I think the board can look at revenue sharing, any part of revenue sharing that they want and has. I think that's their role and we do. And we look at customer satisfaction, we look at reliability, we look at, a lot of the metrics with the efficient utility management. So I don't disagree that, that the utilities should be reviewed even when they're in a revenue sharing arrangement. But I think, and I'll stand on our comments about whether, I think the cost allocation question has been addressed and gets looked at periodically as well. So, I mean, we should have some comfort that rates are cost-based. And, I think looking at the testimony in the current rate-making principles docket, I mean, if there was a rate case, the impacts wouldn't be all that different unless you significantly change the cost allocation. And then you'd have a huge shift of cost to residential, small commercial. And I don't understand how that's a good thing. So, if we thought there were grounds for investigation or, a need to review how things are working, I think we would certainly ask for that. And we have that duty. So I guess I'm just not sure that a legislative change is needed in this area.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not proposing any legislative changes to address revenue sharing. I think the issue is before the board, how they want to deal with revenue sharing. They created it, so they need to look and see whether there needs to be some other way of dealing with it or review.
Any other comments on revenue sharing at this time? And if not, let's take a quick 15-minute break. Be back at 2:45.